salmon, tuna, salmon, 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 pollock roe, salmon, tuna, salmon, tuna, salmon, salmon, kelp, salmon, salmon roe, mustard leaf, salmon, salmon, tuna mayo, salmon, 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 salted roe, salmon, salmon, tuna mayo, salmon, mustard leaf, salted roe, pollock roe, salmon, tuna mayo, mustard leaf, kelp, salmon, salted roe, bonito flakes, salted roe, salmon, pollock roe, salmon, 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 tuna mayo, salmon, salmon roe. Blast away, blast away, blast away, blast away, blast away, blast away. Stop, 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 stop. Fall, 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 fall. Salmon roe, mustard leaf, salmon roe, kelp, pollock roe, salmon, salmon roe, tuna mayo, salted roe, mustard leaf, kelp, salmon roe, mustard leaf, salmon, 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 salmon roe, pollock roe, tuna, tuna, bonito flakes, salmon roe, mustard leaf, pollock roe. Don't move, don't move, don't move, don't move, don't move, don't move. Get twisted, get twisted, get twisted, get twisted, get twisted. Get twisted! Salmon, bonito flakes, pollock roe, tuna mayo, mustard leaf, pollock roe. Salmon, tuna, 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 salmon, mustard leaf, pollock roe, tuna mayo, pollock roe, bonito flakes, pollock roe, tuna mayo, kelp, tuna, bonito flakes, salted roe, salmon, pollock roe, mustard leaf, pollock roe, tuna, tuna mayo, salmon roe, salmon, salmon roe, tuna, tuna, salmon, tuna, tuna, salmon, salmon, tuna, salmon, tuna, bonito flakes, tuna, bonito flakes, salmon, salted roe, tuna mayo, salmon, salmon, mustard leaf, tuna mayo, pollock roe, salmon, pollock roe, mustard leaf, pollock roe, salmon roe, pollock roe, salmon roe, salmon, mustard leaf, tuna, mustard leaf, salmon, tuna, salmon roe, tuna, bonito flakes, salmon, salmon roe, tuna mayo, pollock roe, salmon, salted roe, tuna mayo, bonito flakes, salted roe. Salmon, salmon, pollock roe, salmon roe, bonito flakes, salmon, salmon, kelp, mustard leaf, tuna, bonito flakes, salmon, bonito flakes, tuna, salmon roe, salmon, salmon roe, bonito flakes, tuna, bonito flakes, bonito flakes, salmon, salmon roe, mustard leaf, tuna mayo, bonito flakes, tuna, bonito flakes, salmon roe, kelp, bonito flakes, tuna, bonito flakes, kelp, salmon, bonito flakes, tuna, tuna, kelp, bonito flakes, bonito flakes, salted roe. Get crushed! Explode! Salmon, bonito flakes, kelp, bonito flakes, mustard leaf, pollock roe, salmon, salted roe, pollock roe, mustard leaf, salmon roe, tuna mayo, salmon, salmon roe, salted roe, salmon, 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 tuna mayo, mustard leaf, kelp, bonito flakes, salmon roe, pollock roe, mustard leaf, salmon, tuna mayo, salmon roe, pollock roe, salmon roe, mustard leaf, yellowfin tuna prawn roe, salmon, 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 kelp, tuna, bonito flakes, salmon, 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 salmon roe, salmon, tuna, tuna, salmon roe. Stop! Get crushed! Explode! Blast away! Jujutsu Kaisen, kelp, salted roe, bonito flakes, salmon roe, bonito flakes, salted roe, tuna mayo, salmon, tuna, kelp, bonito flakes, salmon, 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 pollock roe, salmon, salmon, tuna mayo, salmon, salmon, salmon roe, salmon, salted roe, kelp, salmon, salted roe, salmon, salted roe, salmon roe, salmon, salmon roe, tuna mayo, pollock roe, kelp, salmon, salmon, tuna, kelp, salmon, bonito flakes, pollock roe, kelp, bonito flakes, tuna salmon, tuna bonito flakes, mustard leaf, tuna, mustard leaf, salmon roe, kelp, pollock roe, salmon roe, kelp, pollock roe, tuna mayo, mustard leaf, pollock roe, tuna mayo, mustard leaf, pollock roe, salmon, pollock roe, bonito flakes, pollock roe, bonito flakes, kelp, mustard leaf, kelp, mustard leaf, tuna, salmon roe, salmon, tuna, salmon roe, salmon, tuna, kelp, salmon, salted roe, bonito flakes, tuna, salmon roe, kelp, tuna, pollock roe, salmon, bonito flakes, salted roe, mustard leaf, tuna mayo, kelp, tuna, mustard leaf, salmon, pollock roe, salmon, bonito flakes, tuna, salmon roe, salted roe, kelp, pollock roe, tuna mayo, mustard leaf, bonito flakes, yellowfin tuna, prawn roe, tuna mayo, salted roe, tuna, salmon, tuna, pollock roe, tuna, salmon, tuna mayo, tuna, mustard leaf, pollock roe, salmon, tuna, salmon, mustard leaf, salmon, pollock roe, tuna, pollock roe, salted roe, salmon roe, bonito flakes, salmon, tuna, bonito flakes, salmon roe, pollock roe, bonito flakes, kelp, salted roe, bonito flakes, tuna mayo, tuna, mustard leaf, salmon roe, salmon, pollock roe, bonito flakes, salmon roe, tuna mayo, salted roe, pollock roe, mustard leaf, salmon roe, tuna, salmon, pollock roe, mustard leaf, salmon roe, pollock roe, salmon, bonito flakes, tuna mayo, bonito flakes, kelp, tuna, salted roe, kelp, tuna, salted roe, salmon, bonito flakes, salted roe, tuna mayo, mustard leaf, kelp, salmon roe, pollock roe, salted roe, mustard leaf, pollock roe, salted roe, salmon, mustard leaf, tuna mayo, salmon roe.
鮭、ツナ、鮭、明太子、鮭、ツナ、鮭、昆布、鮭、イクラ、高菜、鮭、ツナマヨ、鮭、筋子、鮭、ツナマヨ、鮭、高菜、筋子、明太子、鮭、ツナマヨ、高菜、昆布、鮭、筋子、おかか、筋子、鮭、明太子、鮭、ツナマヨ、鮭、イクラ、ぶっ飛べ、止まれ、落ちろ、イクラ、高菜、イクラ、昆布、明太子、鮭、イクラ、ツナマヨ、筋子、高菜、昆布、イクラ、高菜、鮭、イクラ、明太子、ツナ、おかか、イクラ、高菜、明太子、動くな、ねじれろ、鮭、おかか、明太子、ツナマヨ、高菜、明太子、だ、や、ら、だ、つ、ふ、なら、ね、や、せ、は、た、せ、だ、うら、な、は、うら、だ、しゃ、鮭、ツナ、鮭、高菜、明太子、ツナマヨ、明太子、おかか、明太子、ツナマヨ、昆布、ツナ、おかか、筋子、鮭、明太子、高菜、明太子、ツナマヨ、イクラ、鮭、イクラ、ツナ、 鮭ツナ鮭ツナツナおかかツナおかか鮭筋子ツナマヨ鮭高菜ツナマヨ明太子鮭明太子高菜明太子イクラ明太子イクラ鮭高菜ツナ高菜鮭ツナイクラツナおかか鮭イクラツナマヨ明太子鮭筋子ツナマヨおかか筋子がなかうけけがうばうなげげなぎゃわだだげげ鮭明太子イクラおかか鮭昆布高菜ツナおかか鮭おかかツナイクラが鮭イクラおかかツナおかかおかか鮭イクラ高菜ツナマヨおかかツナおかかイクラ昆布おかかツナおかか昆布鮭おかかツナ昆布おかか筋子つぶれろはぜろ鮭おかか昆布おかか高菜明太子鮭筋子明太子高菜イクラツナマヨ鮭イクラ筋子鮭ツナマヨ高菜昆布おかかイクラ明太子高菜鮭ツナマヨイクラ明太子イクラ高菜鮭イクラ明太子鮭昆布ツナおかか鮭イクラ鮭ツナイクラ止まれ潰れろはぜろぶっ飛べ呪術廻戦昆布筋子おかかイクラおかか筋子ツナマヨ鮭ツナ昆布おかか鮭明太子鮭ツナマヨ鮭イクラ鮭筋子昆布鮭筋子筋子イクラ鮭イクラツナマヨ明太子昆布鮭ツナ昆布鮭おかか明太子昆布おかかツナ鮭ツナおかか高菜イクラ昆布明太子イクラ昆布明太子ツナマヨ高菜明太子ツナマヨ高菜明太子鮭明太子明太子おかか明太子おかか昆布高菜ツナイクラ鮭ツナイクラ鮭ツナ昆布鮭筋子おかかツナイクラ昆布ツナ明太子鮭おか筋子高菜ツナマヨ昆布ツナ高菜鮭明太子鮭おかかツナ鮭イクラ筋子昆布明太子ツナマヨ高菜おかか鮭イクラ明太子ツナマヨ筋子ツナ鮭ツナ明太子ツナ鮭ツナマヨツナ高菜明太子鮭ツナ鮭高菜鮭明太子ツナ明太子筋子イクラおかか鮭ツナおかかイクラ明太子おかか昆布筋子おかかツナマヨツナ高菜鮭イクラ鮭明太子おかかイクラツナマヨ筋子明太子高菜イクラツナ鮭 鮭明太子高菜明太子高菜イクラ明太子鮭おかかツナマヨおかか昆布ツナすじこ昆布ツナツナツナすじこ鮭おかかすじこツナマヨ高菜昆布イクラ明太子すじこ高菜明太子すじこ鮭高菜ツナマヨイクラ